Well, hi, everybody. As people gather to our event here, I'm going to welcome you, and I'm going to welcome you casually and preliminarily here, so we give people a chance to join on, and then we will get underway. I'm Frank Sesno, and you are joining a remarkable Planet Forward salon, and which we have done in coordination with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation today. And I know you'll find it fascinating because we're going to be talking about Indigenous peoples and cultures and knowledge and how that should and can inform our notion of healthy, accessible food, and more to the point, sustainable food, sustainable agriculture. How can we grow things? And as the climate talks in Glasgow take place, and as we think about how climate change is compounding the problems of feeding a growing planet, this conversation about learning from Indigenous cultures and knowledge is more relevant than ever. So again, I'd like to welcome you all, and I'd like to encourage you as we go through the conversation here to use the Q&A function on your Zoom to send questions into us. And this is a fascinating panel, a fascinating discussion, as I say, and we'll get as many questions in as we can. So I'm going to start now officially and formally, and I'm going to say I'm delighted to welcome you to this Planet Forward Salon Series, Indigenous Peoples, Cultures, Food, Lessons in Sustainable Food. I'd like to welcome you to my home. I wish we were all in one room together, but this does allow us to reach across the country and actually around the world and have a wonderful conversation with a very broad group of people, an interested group of people. Planet Forward is based at the George Washington University. We work with many colleges and universities, students, faculty, scientists, academics, experts in environmental and sustainable life, and in media and storytelling and communication across the country. This past summer, we teamed up with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and we had 4 designated student fellows. And they looked at various aspects, facets of food, the way we grow it, tend it, eat it. And we had 4 fellows. They did this series of stories. It was a great series. And one of the stories we're going to use to kick off today's topic, Indigenous practices in food. And so while we'll broaden the conversation out, I just think it's wonderful to start with a story that sort of tees this up from Terrius Harris. So please join me in welcoming Terrius Harris. Terrius was a graduate student at the University of Mississippi, and he did his story from Hawaii. Terrius, tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Frank. I'm so happy to be here today. Yes, thank you so much. So my name is Terrius Harris, as you already know. I had the wonderful opportunity to be a storytelling fellow this summer, where I covered some pretty amazing stories in Hawaii. I am normally coming to you from DC as of late. However, this weekend, I'm coming to you from Seminole Territory in Florida, and I'm very grateful to be here today.
The story series that you and the other FAO fellows, Planet Forward FAO fellows, sort of plugged into, we call it Recipes for Food Security. And you did a story out of Hawaii, as you said, looking at some Indigenous practices. The subject was?
The return of loko'ia. So loko'ia fish ponds.
So tell us about fish ponds and what you were talking about in the story.
Yeah, so I had a really amazing opportunity to attend, to visit Loko'ia, which is in the North Shore, Haleiwa area of Oahu in Hawaii. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to go and learn how local fish ponds are being revitalized through Native Hawaiian practices, and just being brought back to light through Olelo, which is storytelling, and also revitalizing that land. And it's been an amazing opportunity to learn more about Native Hawaiian culture, but also compare it to my own and learn about the different works that Indigenous people are doing worldwide.
I just want to say that we've got people, Terrius, and to our audience, and you see this if you're following the chat, who are joining us from all over the world, from Egypt and Ethiopia, from Arizona and across America. Let's put up, if we can put up the Planet Forward page and your story, Recipes for Food Security, the Return of Loko'ia. One of the things I'd like to do is I'd like to just read a quick quote from it, because I think this is really interesting. You quote Sayo Costantino, who's the head of the Operations and Education part of the program there in the story, in a quote that I think is really quite telling and very, really quite eloquent, and saying Loko'ia is doing what it's doing, facilitating a fish parting system in which they take the fish pond, what the fish pond naturally gives, instead of pushing the system to a potential breaking point. Profit is not the goal, it's for our community. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so I think that if we break it down a little bit, we think about our modern age, especially with colonization. There came this capitalistic mindset that profit should be the goal of all the work that's being done. What Local AF focuses on is more of an indigenous approach of giving what the land provides and not trying to make a profit off of the land or off of the space, and cohabitating and coinciding with the land itself. So not taking more than it is willing to give, and using that what it is willing to give wisely for those in the community.
Terrius, where does your interest in indigenous cultures come from? And what do you think, based on this story and other things that you have done, that you and we can learn from these cultures when we think about sustainable agriculture more broadly?
So my specific interest comes due to my indigenous background, but I think that what can be learned by companies and organizations is there should be a balance. I understand that in this capitalistic mindset that most of our world holds, that we aim for profit, we aim to get that bottom dollar, and we aim to to make our budget larger. However, I think that if we approach our world in a way that we think should be more sustainable, it can be more advantageous not only for that company, but also for humanity in general, by not taking more than what the world is willing to give us and what the land is willing to give us. Because cohabitating and coinciding with the land is a very large fundamental aspect of indigenous agriculture. And I think that is what more organizations and companies should adopt in order to create a more sustainable future for not only those communities, but for the world.
Terrius, a couple of more quick questions, then I'm going to bring the panel. I want to ask you about another quote in your story, which really struck me. It's from Makua Perry, who works on the project, saying at Loko'ea, oh, there it went away now, there it is. There's a framework that has been created by a generation of storytellers within our culture that helps us understand what we do or don't see with our eyes because it's not there. It's those types of stories that are traveled through our ancestors that kind of create and maintain the cultural integrity of space and the people. You were a storyteller doing this story. And the whole idea of oral traditions and storytelling is something that's very prominent. I just wonder if you talk about that for a minute and the role you see that playing from where you were coming from.
Yeah, so as you already know, Frank, oral traditions is a very strong fundamental portion or a foundation of indigenous culture in general. However, I will say that it was really amazing to have this opportunity to learn about it in Native Hawaiian context, which is through Olelo, and realizing how much Olelo plays within not only the culture of Hawaii, but also just to see how much is ingrained within day-to-day society. It was really amazing. So from learning some Olelo to from learning Mo'olelo to understanding the importance of Olelo within the culture was absolutely a wonderful opportunity for me to not only grow within my understanding of Hawaiian culture, but also within that of my own indigenous culture as well, and recognize the comparison and contrast between the two and how in many ways we are very similar. And I would say that even from, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, say what, finish up.
Oh, I would say even from my other stories that I have covered and different opportunities that I've had, that's been one of the things that I've seen in common between indigenous cultures and tribes and areas. So that's been a really awesome thing to be able to continue to grow.
And I want to just tell everybody they should go to Planet Forward, check out Terrius's other very talented and very creative reporting. Before I let you go, Terrius, what do you want to do with your life?
My goal is to hopefully work for the United Nations one day, focusing on indigenous people's rights for land and human rights. That's the ultimate goal. We'll see how that works out.
Okay, well, we won't take this as a job application right here, but I want to thank you, and I look forward to seeing you when you're in Washington next time. Terrius, thanks for all your work. Terrius is going to dip his camera now. I'm going to invite our panelists on, and I would like to introduce you to them. They're some remarkable people who are doing really great work and are very, very connected to a variety of different communities. So panelists, please unmute your cameras, unmute your mics. I will introduce you as you join, and here we go. And I think we've got John, one more, and then we'll be ready to go. But why don't I start by introducing you to Denisa Livingston. Hi, Denisa. Denisa, why don't you unmute your mic, and I'll introduce you this way. Denisa, you're speaking from where? Where are you right now?
I am in the Four Corners area, the Navajo Nation, Diné, in the New Mexico part.
And the work that you do is what?
Oh, that's a big question. Really working on raising awareness about nutritional trauma and food sovereignty, seed sovereignty, data sovereignty, and all of that.
And you are with the Diné Community Advocacy Alliance, yes?
That's right. I organize that here, and as well as Slow Food International.
And you're interested in slow food in Turtle Island and a few other things?
Yes, gastronomy, social gastronomy, seed saving, growing food, eating good food, eating healthful food.
And growing some of it right over your shoulder. So we'll talk about that in just a bit. It's great to have you. Karletta Chief, welcome to the conversation as well. You are joining us from where?
Yeah, it's Frank. I am joining from the traditional homelands of the Paskayake Tahana Atham peoples. I am an associate professor and extension specialist at the University of Arizona. And I'm also Diné, and I work in the areas of the food, energy, water nexus, and working to, with my team and students at the University of Arizona and other collaborators to address food, energy, water insecurities for off-grid Indigenous communities in Arizona.
And I know you've got a lot of experience in hydrology and water is such a big part of this, right? So how do you apply that in your work?
Actually, Frank, what you see behind me is the Little Colorado River, which I crossed last Friday with my partners at Six World Solutions, Ginny Yazi and Kern Collymore, who are really active in the Indigenous peoples advocacy with the United Nations. And water is really critical when we talk about agriculture and how the Indigenous communities in the Southwest have really optimized the use of water with growing foods. So in addition today with climate change amplifying water insecurities, that is what I work in, not only in agriculture, but also for human consumption, so which is further important.
It's very important, especially on the Navajo Nation, other places where the challenges are so really extraordinary. And John Manirakiza, John is joining us. John is a farm manager at Florencia Farm in Upper Marlborough. So John, tell people a little bit about yourself and what you do at Florencia Farm and your background.
Thank you, Frank, for inviting me, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation. Based in the DC metro area, my farm is in Upper Marlborough, Prince George's County in Maryland. Born and raised in Burundi, Central East Africa. And I've been in the US for about 23 years. And recently, as many years as 10, I've been interested in growing indigenous food for the Afro-Caribbean communities that are in the US. So working with universities to do research for adaptability and traditional ways of growing this and modern way of growing this food.
And we'll talk about that. Just so everybody knows, what are some of these, just very quickly, what are some of these indigenous foods from the Afro-Caribbean culture that you have now brought here and are growing here?
So I grow some African eggplants, some of the variety of eggplants from Turkish eggplants. I grow hibiscus, a lot of hibiscus. Celosia is also known as a Lagos spinach. Water leaf, it's another type of green. We grow Malabar spinach. We grow a variety of hot peppers. People like the spices. I grow the moringa, I grow the turmeric. All these kinds of products are part of what we call food is medicine. So most of our traditional.
All right. Well, we'll have to come visit and go on a taste test along with everything else, but we'll come back and have the conversation.
Absolutely.
But we've done some of that already, and I just want to, attest to the high quality of John's produce. It's excellent. Michaela Way is the Indigenous Peoples Liaison for North America with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. Hi, Michaela. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about your background and what you do as the liaison?
Sure. Thanks so much, Frank. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you today. I'm calling in from along the Ichiwana. I'm in Oregon, along the traditional territories of the Wasco and many of the River People Nations. And what I'm doing as a liaison for Indigenous Peoples of North America with the Food and Agriculture Organization is opening up lines of communication between the global conversations and the global efforts being led by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples' food systems internationally, as well as the tremendous work being led across the North American region of the Indigenous nations here.
Fabulous. Denisa, let me start and come to you, and let me start with you. I know you're a gardener. I see your plants over your shoulder. We all see that. I also know that you wrote a piece called "The Power of Corn, Beans, and Squash." What is the special relationship that you see with these three sisters and Indigenous traditions, knowledge, cultures, and food? Launch us with a sort of a brief but conceptual framework here.
Thank you. Yeah, so I come from the Red House People Clan, and we come from a matrilineal, matriarchal society, and the female roles of who we are is really important to growing, to nourishing our communities. And what's really critical about the relationship of the three sisters is really that relational equity and relational intelligence that we carry as Indigenous peoples when we have a relationship with the food. As we know that the promotion of our holistic vision as Indigenous peoples is very much tied to the land and identity, spirituality, traditional medicine. And as we know that as Indigenous people, there are many relationships that we carry to be able to navigate the strategies, to implement the solutions from the problems that we have. But it is intergenerational, multifaceted, multi-generational work that comes from ancestral knowledge, ancestral wisdom, to be able to incorporate our growing methods and also harvesting methods, and also preserving our food, and knowing that those relationships is built on the need to be able to encompass what grandma is teaching us, what our great grandmother has passed forward, seeing the beauty of the seeds in the ground, and becoming intimate with the soil, really knowing the true beauty of the soil, and knowing that our healthy heirloom foods is very critical to addressing the challenges that we see worldwide regarding climate change and all.
Karletta, let me come to you. When you think of this relationship and you think of the challenges we mentioned a moment ago, climate change and water, what special challenges are there now with growing this food in the environment in which we now exist?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that, climate change has really impacted Indigenous communities in different ways that really ties to their connection, deep connection to the land, as my grandmother Denisa explained, where our livelihoods are deep within the land, but not also our livelihoods, but our identity, our beliefs, our teachings that come through stories. So when climate change impacts us, it also impacts all of those cultural connections. But I think that with our communities, there's returning back to what our elders have been teaching us. Indigenous foods that have been growing are more resilient to climate change and to drought, and have more nutritional value, more fiber, and that coming back to food sovereignty is important for our people.
But I just want to interrupt for 1 second, because the term food sovereignty has come up in conversations with all of you. And for those who may be listening to this who either haven't heard that term before or aren't sure what it means, would you define that, please? What do we mean by food sovereignty?
Yes, I'm sure Michaela has a formal definition in her line of work. For me, food sovereignty is really the sovereignty, the ability of our Indigenous communities to practice their long traditions of growing foods for millennia, and the ability to practice that transcends governmental boundaries, social boundaries that have been imposed on us from colonial systems.
John, I'm going to come to you and ask you to comment on this from your perspective, and which of these themes of Indigenous experience, food, and knowledge resonate from your perspective. But before I do that, I'm just so excited with the audience that we've got and some of the comments that are already appearing in the chat. And I just need to welcome you all. I'm seeing Hallie, who's tuning in from Tucson on Tohono O'odham territory. I see Kate, the Director of Urban Agriculture in Washington, join us. I see someone tuning in from Ottawa, Canada, on the unceded territory of the, and I hope I pronounced this right, Anabi Algonquin Nation. Just wanted to say hi from Stanford, says someone else, a lumber doctoral student. So we've got tremendous geographical and reach in interests as well. John, from what you just heard from Denisa and Karletta, which of these Indigenous experiences also resonate with you from your part of the world and your Indigenous experience?
No, absolutely. They are both right, because we, talking from an African point of view, the biodiversity of the natural resources we have is being respected by our traditions and our elders for many, many, many centuries before the new dominant food system was established. So it's important for our people to actually be aware of these traditions. For example, in West Africa, they have traditions of improving soil by creating some form of compost, traditional compost, and they will enrich the soil where they will grow a lot of, diversified crops. And these were before colonial time. And so some of those practices are important for us to actually go back to. The practices of, let's say, no-till technology, where you make sure you don't move the land or you don't just chop the microorganism in the soil, is a practice that has been there for many years. So our ancestors did respect nature, and they continue to respect nature. They work with what they have. They don't use a lot of input from outside nature. So those are some of the things that we think are very important for us and our next generation to know that they are alternative to this other system of growing food.
Michaela, I'll come to you in just a minute, but let me go back to Denisa and then Karletta to follow up on what John was just talking about. Could I ask each of you to talk about a particular technique or experience that is unique or particular to Indigenous agriculture and cultivation? Certainly where you are, you're in fundamentally inhospitable territory, so you don't have mass irrigation. Denisa, might you want to talk about that? Whether it's mounds or other kinds of things that are kind of intrinsic to the experience?
Mm-hmm. There are many examples, but I think one that really hits home to me is my grandfather died from direct contamination of uranium when the US government opened the uranium mines here on our Navajo Nation. We're still looking to the efforts of cleaning up and asking the government to clean up these abandoned uranium mines. But one of the really critical things that have come in this time is the bioremediation, using mushrooms to be able to clean the soil, to be able to heal the land completely when government agencies are only looking to 50% cleanup, but we're looking to 100% cleanup, and looking to the fungus, looking to how we can incorporate indigenous strategies and traditions to be able to see, you know, the health that we need in our environment, especially when that contamination is widespread in the land, in the air, in the soil. And that is one critical thing when we're thinking about growing, is that in most places, many of our people do not have the healthy soil to be able to grow. So we're having to address those injustices that have occurred to our people to be able to reincorporate that healthy soil, but also to learn those strategies that many agencies need to be learning about, the indigenous practices of bioremediation.
Karletta, could I ask you to talk a little bit, for example, about dryland farming, spiral mounds, traditional seeds, some of that, explain some of that to people.
Yes, and I want to just acknowledge my clan grandmother Denisa's comments about contamination.
Mm-hmm.
So I had the honor to work with the Diné communities that were impacted by the Gold Key mine spill that happened in 2015. And the agencies didn't understand why the Diné farmers didn't want to go back to farming, despite that the EPA designated the waters to meet agricultural use. And that directly links to that preciousness of the heirloom seeds and the questions of what would be the impact, long-term impact to these seeds, and the ability of the future generations to continue this tradition of using these seeds. And so, you know, that just goes to elevate the critical protection of these seeds that are directly linked to sustainability and indigenous agriculture for those communities. And now to answer your question about the different examples, I've had the honor to work with indigenous agricultural knowledge holders and experts. And like I was saying, there's a return back to these practices that some of them have been lost. Some examples are the spiral mounds of the tribes in southern Arizona, where there is one farmer that has gone back to the elders and finding these traditional heirloom seeds that have been preserved in these glass containers, and then bringing back the spiral mounds, which, like John was saying, is the kind of the no-till approach. And I grew up with my father farming, and we used a planting stick and using you know, a certain depth where you would go down and you basically have this no-till, and you would plant the corn, the heirloom seeds in that way. So, you know, there's a lot of outside types of agriculture that have encroached in our communities, and there is a movement to go back to our our traditional ways of practices. And I'm really glad to see that. And there's other examples, like with the Hopi Tribe, with dryland farming, where they optimize the amount of water use to sustain their fields. And they have been doing this for so long.
Yeah, can we talk about that though? Just so what does that mean? Dryland farming and optimizing the water, right? And is that fundamentally different? If you drive through farm territory in much of the country, you see these massive fields and huge irrigation operations. What are the Hopi doing that are different?
So the Hopi are doing dryland farming by planting in areas where they have observed for many centuries, of where there is areas where there's monsoons that occur, and water that flows through different canyons, and they observe which areas have higher deposition of sediments that really contribute to the soil health. and then rotating those farms based on, their observations of where they see the deposition and where they've planted in the past. And you talk about climate change impacts as well. Indigenous peoples in this region have shifted their agriculture and based on the shifting ecosystems.
Right.
But with the boundaries that have been imposed by the United States, that has limited a lot of our communities to continue this practice.
Michaela, let me come over to you. You're with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. You're the Indigenous Peoples Liaison. So as you hear these sorts of, and FAO, its interests, and I want to thank you and FAO for working with us and working with our fellows and making this possible. It's a very important topic and conversation. What is your job? Is your job to learn from all and disseminate knowledge? Is your job to sort of connect? What do you take from this, and how are you applying it in your work?
The answer is yes to both. The answer is to learn and to connect. And on a big scale, the UN is responsible for working with the member state countries, right? And so when we zoom out to that scale, my job, my responsibility with the Indigenous Peoples Unit, as well as with the Liaison Office in North America, is to work with the member states and the Indigenous peoples to ensure that within the policies that member states are putting forward and implementing in policy and practice, in voluntary guidelines, in co-creation of knowledge, that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' systems of knowledge and food systems and rights are at the table and influencing the policy and influencing the adaptations that are necessary right now. As we've heard from Denisa and Dr. Chief and John, all of these systems of knowledge have been intact since time immemorial. And they're some of the most sustainable food systems in the world. So if FAO is supposed to be a normative agency working internationally with member states to implement best practices and policies and procedures, Indigenous peoples are key leaders and allies in that work.
So let's talk about that. Before I do though, Denisa, I just have to point out that we got a note here from Trish in the chat who said, my elders taught me about a fourth sister, sunflowers, for pollinators and for hope. So is there a fourth sister too?
Yes, you can add as many sisters that build to the ecosystem. The sunflowers are very beautiful to provide the shade, but they also are our teachers, because young sunflowers, their circadian rhythm is that they're following the sun all day long.
Right.
And we know with our youth, they're following us and watching every movement that we're making. And so we are learning from the sunflowers, but also the other sisters like pumpkins, that we can add some other vegetation, that is critical. But it is a beautiful thing as we see the ecosystems around trees, like tree gills, or, in our gardens and our farms, and the spirals, how they work, in relationship with one another. And the stronger the relationship is, the more abundance and vitality that there is.
John, let me come to you to pick up on what Michaela was saying, where she was talking about best practices. What are some of the best practices that you have brought from Indigenous knowledge from Burundi and that you are now applying at your farm here in Maryland, Florencia Farm?
Good question. Though I'm new to farming, back in Burundi, when my mother wanted me to go to farm, I will protest. But now I just see the wisdom in taking me to the farm. But some of the practices that we use here, I do drip irrigation. I do not turn the soil. I do not add any artificial input. I allow the plants to actually fend for themselves. And sometimes my produce is not the shiny produce that you'll see in the grocery store. And that is by intention, that I don't want to apply artificial input. And my customers are very happy with the produce that come from there.
So are you able to maximize your output? If you were using some of these other products, would you grow more? Would it be bigger, greener, redder? And
Yes.
It would. So
Yes.
So that's a trade-off?
Yeah, it's a trade-off. As we were talking, the conversations about the whole comprehensive thinking about health, thinking about the environment, thinking about society. So we can do the trade-off on the profit side while we present an alternative to our community of another type of food. So yeah, that's a trade-off, yes.
Denisa, what are best practices from your perspective that can be applied to the broader production agriculture community, or is that not possible?
That's a big question. And I know that depending on where you come from and what lands you're on, what resources that you have, I think we have to understand our footprint. What we are growing, like our brother said, 75% of what we eat comes from only 12 species. That's, from unhealthy food, that is from having hamburgers and, the processed, the crap, the CRAP, carbonated, refined, artificial processed foods. And the other foods that we're eating is about 150 species. But when we look at the amount of species that we could be eating from, it ranges from 250,000 to 300,000 species. Looking at the tubers, looking at the insects, looking at the roots, looking at fermentation, looking at the way, that we're growing the food, like our brother said. But I think one of the really critical things is we need to stop monocropping, planting only one crop. Every one of us, our plants and our crops, they all need to be in relationship, just like us as human beings, our plants as well. The 3 sisters, the 4 sisters, 5 sisters, really look at how we're using water, really look at how, what seeds that we're planting, what seeds, that we are harvesting and also seed saving, but as well as sharing that knowledge across the world, that we can't just learn from, one particular people. It's everyone's responsibility as we're thinking about agroecology and sustainable food systems, looking at the diverse knowledge and wisdom and practices that are out there that we need to incorporate, especially in the schools, especially in our youth and what they should be learning at school, but also just incorporating taste education in the way that we can go out into the field and eat straight from the field, and put it in our mouth, rather than going through the whole processing system of, finally 6 months later getting a product and then getting it into our stores. We need to be able to go straight to our gardens and our farms to be able to eat from there, but also harvest from there, but also know that the future of our health lies in that field. So right. I think there's a lot of different concepts, but also, we know that we're up against a big giant, big ag. They may never go away, but the power lies on us. I always say for tribal communities that we can bring sovereignty to the kitchen table. And my last comment is that really we need to be able to transform not only our plates, but our palates, but also knowing that we need to change the language, knowing that we can use our indigenous languages for liberation. And the journey has to be liberating. So I think there's so many different conversations. I'm sure everyone has something to contribute to this.
Yeah, and I want to come back to some of that and some of the work you've done. And the tax that you've gotten on junk food, I think, is really important. Like that, this sort of retraining our palate is a gigantically important component to this. Let's try to come back to that. I also want to get to some questions from our wonderful audience here. Michaela, though, I want to come over to you. John's farm, Florencia farm, is 5 acres. Many of the farms, and having spoken to our other 2 guests, Denisa and Dr. Chief, I know that many of the farms there are smaller farms. Around the world, most farmers and most indigenous farmers are on smaller farms, smallholder farms. We have 7 billion people in the world. We're headed to 11 billion people in the world. And many will say that we can't just do this with smallholder farms, that we need production agriculture. We need massive amounts of food produced using science and using the most efficient and productive technologies possible. What is the mix? What role can indigenous smallholder farmers play in feeding this planet?
I think it's a really important question, Frank. And I want to also include in this that, yes, some Indigenous peoples' food systems are based on cultivation and based on an agricultural method. And many Indigenous peoples' food systems are based on food generation, incorporating fish, as Terrius was talking about, uncovering in his stories from Hawaii and the local Ia. And the fisheries, the hunting, the harvesting, the forestry. So I think we need to think about farming in addition to all of the food generation systems that Indigenous peoples have stewarded and tended and sustained for millennia. So I think your question specifically about smallholder farmers is important. And I think part of it is that we need to challenge our thinking and we need to learn from Indigenous peoples' food systems in addition, beyond the farming systems. For the farming systems, I think there's strength, as Denisa was speaking to, in diversifying our food base. And that a lot of the smallholder farmers are growing a more diverse food base than our large scale production agricultural systems are. And I think that's a really important point that we need to look at, in addition to what John and Dr. Chief were talking about of inputs, water use, climate adaptability, and that our smallholder farmers are able to adapt and use the inputs and the no-till mechanisms on scales that can produce tremendous amounts of food with shorter value chains that stay within a community. And so the resilience of that community, the adaptability of that community is actually strengthened because the food systems is localized and it's adapted for that ecosystem where they are. So I think the mix that you're asking about is, I think the large scale production systems need to look at the practices and principles from Indigenous peoples' food systems of diversifying the food base, of sustainable inputs, of reciprocal relationships, of self-sufficiency. And I think while they may not be able to emulate an Indigenous people's food system, I think they need to look at the practices and procedures, because in the long term, I think these food systems of massive production scale risk petering out. And I think we need to, like John was saying, evaluating the risk analysis and the cost benefit analysis of what are the impacts of these systems versus the benefit of the massive amount of food being produced. So I think those are some of the hard questions that we're facing. And I'll share in the chat, but there's a publication that delves into this more that the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit just released, and diving more into the practices and procedures and principles that Indigenous peoples carry.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this question, sort of balancing Indigenous methods, smallholder farms, large production agriculture? John,
Yeah.
Dr. Chief, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just add that indeed the indigenous systems are older than the new system, and so they've been able to survive longer. And there is a value in learning from tradition, even though some traditions, some people, look back and say, hey, it's traditional, we want modern. However, to see that, for example, talking from the African point of view, 1 billion, 300 million people now, they are going to be 3 billion in the next maybe 20, 50 years. We can't rely on the monocrops. And while we have so much biodiversity and our palates are already trained, so we should actually think about, just learning from our elders.
What about the role, and this applies to sub-Saharan Africa, it certainly applies to the Navajo Nation, where it's hot and getting hotter and it's dry. There are crops, GMO, maize, and other things now that have been developed scientifically that can grow with a lot less water and can do better in hot and very dry territories. Does that become incorporated into these traditional methods or not?
One of the issues that we've heard from our elders in the communities is the food sovereignty issue. These genetically modified foods are patented to somebody. So when you depend on somebody else for feeding your children, it is, in our tradition, it's a no-no. So that's pretty much where technology and tradition kind of clash.
Can they not go side by side? Can they not fit? Isn't this going to feed 11 billion people? Aren't we going to need to do all of this?
There's a point for a discussion on technology, the need of technology and working with traditional systems. But we still we still think that sovereignty is important, that people, indigenous peoples should be able to actually say, our food, we can actually have the certainty that our food will continue to feed our people.
Question in from one of our friends in the audience, Kevin Bonine from the University of Arizona. So Dr. Chief, since he's a colleague of yours, I'm going to turn this question to you and you can answer it or ask others to jump in as need be, but it's a great question and it's very timely given the situation. The carbon cycle and carbon sequestration, he writes, have been especially prevalent in the news because of COP26, the climate talks in Glasgow. Are there obvious connections or opportunities via indigenous agriculture practices that tie into mitigating our fossil fuel-driven change in the atmosphere and the ability to measure and monitor CO2 and methane levels?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bonai, for that question. Thank you for joining. And I think this goes back to the unequal and unjust burden of Indigenous peoples to have to mitigate the carbon footprint of other cities and large economic centers that are creating more pollution than Indigenous communities. So I think in that sense, there's still this unjust burden that Indigenous communities carry. Having said that, with Indigenous agriculture and regenerative agriculture, that has been proven to be sequestering carbon and preventing carbon release that otherwise is happening with large-scale agriculture. And that's just to chime in on the previous discussion. I think, like Michaela was saying, Indigenous peoples have these knowledge systems of conservation for both water use and other agricultural practices that are more sustainable, that worldwide need to be recognized in individual users and consumers, that we need to change our practice of overuse and overproduction. That contributes, I think, to the problem globally.
Right. Really interesting point here that I'd like to read from Harris, who writes in and ask you to comment specifically, saying thanks for this great discussion, and I agree, it's a great discussion, so thanks to all of you. There's a lot of talk among companies and NGOs about regenerative agriculture, Harris writes, and many attribute the concept to Native American Indigenous ways. Is the concept they're referring to acceptable and compatible with truly Indigenous ways, concepts, and methods? And I know I've spoken with all of you about regenerative, so Denisa, why don't you go first, and let's just be very interesting to hear a response on this.
Just like my sister Karletta has said, Dr. Chief is right about, how there is really a lack of stewardship when we're talking about harmful extractions and greed and what we're seeing, in the world of, these big companies, causing harm to our communities, causing harm to Mother Earth, the only earth that we're all sharing. And when we're talking about regenerative agriculture or sustainable ag or agroecology, many of these terms are interrelated, but when we talk about our own traditional food systems, we have our own names and our own Indigenous languages. And these words, that have come up, in many conversations, don't recognize, the beauty of where we come from and where, our practices have lied in the traditional ecological knowledge that is there. And so it's really important for us to not colonize the way that we are speaking about, growing our food, because it is sacred. It is a holy practice. It is a holy method of the way that we are surviving to this point. Like our brother John has said, that it is coming from, generations of survival and adaptability and sustainability, that there are other terms, that we need to learn from Indigenous peoples about what do they call their way of growing? What do they call those practices and in songs and ceremonies to be able to heal the land, and also to address the reconciliation, the reparation, the restoration that needs to happen through these ways and channels that we're trying to survive, but also trying to thrive, and also trying to, like we have advocated in the United Nations Food System Summit, is that we need to recognize Indigenous people's food systems as a game-changing solution in itself, not something that is accommodating or not something that is attributing, but coming back and recognizing the science of it.
And I want to repeat your words, as a game-changing solution in itself, is what you just said. I think that's important for people to hear. Very important for people to hear. Dr. Chief, regenerative agriculture, what's your response on that?
Yeah, I think, Indigenous peoples have been doing traditional agriculture for millennia, and now people are excited about regenerative agriculture. We've been doing that for so long, and that term doesn't have to be defined like Denisa said. Within our community, we've been doing it. We have our own words associated with our practices. So yeah, that would be my comment to that.
John, I know you talked about using some regenerative agriculture on your farm.
Yeah, I think I joined my two sisters here in terms of we need a little bit more of listening session from the rest of the world to actually invite these Indigenous peoples to the table, and maybe to be able to redefine what they mean by regenerative or sustainable.
What do you mean? What do you mean by?
It joined the question that sometimes this terminology come up and become the acceptable use, and it's technical. Give you an example. If I go to my people in Burundi and say, let's do the regenerative agriculture, they're going to be asking, the first thing is going to be, what is exactly you mean by regenerative agriculture? And I'm going to have to be able to actually tell them where I learned that term. And they will tell me but we have been doing the same thing, and you coming and you selling to us what we've been doing. So that's kind of like, I want to have like the conversation, the back and forth, where people can actually sit down and have a conversation.
Michaela, I want to come to you with this question, because you work with these organizations, and it's a very important and sensitive point, and that is, how can non-Indigenous people, to John's point, listen and learn without burdening Indigenous communities with the responsibility to be eternal teachers and to alleviate problems that they didn't create?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Frank. I think it's a really important one, and as you said, it's one that needs to be dealt with respectfully and with mindfulness. And as Dr. Chief was saying, and speaking specifically about climate change, Indigenous peoples are disproportionately around the world being impacted by the ramifications and the impacts of climate change, and have arguably contributed the least, and have been, as it's been documented, preserving the most, with 28% of their territory of the world, of the terrestrial land, encompassing 80% of the remaining world's biodiversity and 11% of the world's forests. And that's a reflection of how and who and the practices that all of the speakers have been talking about, of Indigenous peoples all over the world. And so I think as non-Indigenous people, or as people who have not grown up with these traditions and these systems of knowledge and these ways of practicing and being, I think there's a collective responsibility, right? There's a collective responsibility to, as John was saying, to learn and to listen. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge that has been generously been shared and made public by Indigenous peoples, in books, in lectures, in movies, in recordings, and in transferring the oral traditions and the oral knowledge into writing. And so that's one of the things that the FAO does to facilitate, is to help facilitate the transfer of the oral knowledge, the oral traditions into writing that can be informative to policy and public audience. And Indigenous peoples have been doing the same thing. So I think there's a collective responsibility for co-creation of knowledge and for listening and respecting and better understanding the practices and traditions and leadership of Indigenous peoples.
We have just a few minutes left, but I do want to get to this question from Abby, who writes, and I'll let this be a jump ball. So whoever would like to answer it, just go for it. But I think it's a very good question. And then I'm going to come back to everybody and ask you to give us some closing thoughts before we wrap for the day here. But Abby writes, you mentioned during the topic of GMOs this potential need for integration of technology to produce enough food. We know we currently generate more than enough to feed the entire globe, but that there is a lack of equitable distribution and a serious problem of food waste. Abby asks, I'm wondering if there are some lessons Indigenous peoples' food systems can help teach us about reducing waste and centering equitable distribution / food sharing. Anybody want to go for that? Denisa, you want to start with that? Who would like to go first?
I was actually typing in the answer there. a lot of things, and also John mentioned this. It's like, eating what you really eat. We can reduce our food waste. We can reduce waste. Eating seasonally. That's really critical, supporting local food producers, but also reading our Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the U.S. anthology that we recently produced and won 4 Gourmet International Awards on. This is speaking about being intimate with the soil, speaking about, the biodynamics of growing, speaking about, how we can learn about, the sustainable methods of growing, but also knowing that there are so many strategies, solutions, conversations, narratives, perspectives, lived experiences as expertise that is found, in these narratives. But I think it's very critical, how we are seeing food and defining food. We think that food is that crap, but we really need to define, what food is, and also get the message out there, with our youth and with the rest of the world, that we can, survive on many foods, like I said, that are not defined in what is food. And so there are many different things that we can do, but really just eating what we need, but also just growing with what we have, but also using what we have and being resourceful.
Well, I also love what you have to say too, Denisa, about retraining our palate, right? So our palate learns to love the stuff that John is growing and that we're growing, and it's not just grown someplace, put in a package with a bunch of salt and fat and other stuff that is unnecessary and unhealthy. So I don't know if that addresses food waste, but that certainly addresses quality food and better food. Karletta, Chief, would you add something on this subject?
Yes, I think part of this conversation lends to understanding partnerships with Indigenous communities that involve Indigenous-led efforts where the Indigenous knowledges are not only respected, but protected, and that we give, not necessarily give, but we understand that the knowledge is there for that are held by Indigenous communities, and we need to have a national global platform for that is done ethically and respectfully with these Indigenous communities.
There's a wonderful comment from one of our attendees. Indigenous food cycling or waste practices are sacred and rooted in ceremony. And I always suggest reconnecting with the life force of our foodstuffs to reduce waste. Means stop looking at food as wasteful. We must reshape the definitions. It's so important to kind of change our framework here. we could go on, and I would love to go on for hours because there's so much, the conversation is so rich and there's so much we didn't get to, but I think there's a lot of very important points that you raised, and I thank you for that again. But let me invite each of you to try to hit 30 seconds or so of sort of a closing thought. What is one thing you would like each of you, the audience, to come away with firmly here about taking from your experience and the indigenous experience, cultures and peoples, to apply to a more sustainable food system that we all need if we're going to be healthy and survive in a sustainable way on this planet? Denisa, you want to go first?
Sure. I think one of the biggest takeaways is, what our elders have always taught us, that, the practices that we have and the methods and the ways that we live in respecting the lifeways and waterways is really important. Our foodways, that when we practice this way in an indigenous way, there is no waste. And I think, that is a concept too, that comes from, the other practices that have been done that have been harming our communities. One of the really critical things for everyone to take away is the social gastronomy, getting reconnected with yourself, getting to learn where you come from. Your grandma came from somewhere. Your great grandmother went through things that you need to learn, and to really understand your identity and really understand, your purpose in life. But also, as we, come together collectively, learn how to be that co-resistor, not just an ally, but be a co-resistor of Indigenous people's efforts and ways, and, connecting with the local organizers, like Dr. Chief has said, and really the ways to protecting mother.
And you have a cookbook that you'd like to recommend to us?
There are several, and this was our recent publication from last year, but we had a webinar with Michaela on recipes from Turtle Island. And I put the link in the chat. You guys can have a free download, but, there are other materials, watch Gather, that's on, Netflix right now. Get the anthology. We have a new book, with Ashoka, as I'm an Ashoka fellow. We just released this on Indigenous Peoples Day, Unfinished Conversations on Democracy, Race, and the Economy and a Way Forward. So many resources that you guys can have, but follow us on our website at dineadvocacy.org. Thank you.
John, closing thought?
Well, I think Sister Denisa have said it all, but I would say food is medicine. It's a practice that is recognized by a lot of traditions. Let your food be your medicine. That will actually get us to a point where we consume responsibly. We consume good food. We don't waste a lot of it. And I invite everybody to try some African food. It's delicious, it's healthy, it's good for you.
And if you have a cookbook you want to recommend, put it in the chat.
I'm writing it right now.
Okay, good. We'll be watching for that. Michaela, you're the Indigenous Peoples Liaison of the UNFAO. That's a big job. And what are your closing thoughts here?
It is. I'm grateful that I'm not alone in the work. And one of the messages that I want to share is it's the first key message in the book, and it is: the world cannot feed itself sustainably without listening to Indigenous peoples. And so I would just really encourage people to listen and to learn and to better understand and apply what's being shared in this conversation and more broadly, because the Indigenous peoples of this world have been tending this planet and generating multifunctional and holistic food systems for a very long time.
Dr. Karletta, Chief, I saved the last word for you because I think for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is your affiliation with the Resilience Center. And we certainly know we need to be resilient in these times. So what are your closing thoughts?
Thank you, Frank. I also want to just honor the panelists here because they are the experts in this field. And I feel being here at the University of Arizona, the director of the new Indigenous Science Center, what I like to ask for the listeners out there is also to be respectful in the way that you engage with Indigenous communities, respect the knowledge that they hold. And yes, there are many other innovative solutions that are available through technology. And that's how I work with my collaborators here is to do that respectfully. Ask the communities, do they want this technology? And how can we move forward to think together collectively to reach these different types of solutions that are led by the people, are implemented by those communities. So many times, others come in, they drop off technology and the communities don't want it. So I just want to ask those to continue listening and work respectfully with Indigenous communities all over the world.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your in time and your insights, and thank everybody in the audience for listening and for participating. The listening is so important. We need to do a lot more of that. And we have a lot to learn. Food waste is a story that many, many students write about. They're very well aware of it. We waste 40% of the food that we grow. It's an ungodly figure. It's an unconscionable figure. So much of the food, Denisa, to your point, that we consume is unhealthy, and it's just mass produced, and it's cheaper and it's more readily accessible, and we need to change that. And that's not just retraining our palate, but it's retraining, our minds a little bit as to what is desirable. Thank you all so much. On behalf of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, Michaela, to you and your colleagues, we're so grateful for this. We're honored by your presence. And if you're interested in telling some of these stories or encouraging students, to tell stories, I would ask you to go and check out planetforward.org. That's why we're here. We want to tell these stories. We want to show people solutions grounded in experience and truth and in centuries and millennia of learning. So to all of you, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week ahead. And I hope our paths will cross again and frequently. So thank you. And thank you to our audience.